The media landscape of 2017 has changed drastically from what it was in the late 1980s when cable TV systems expanded beyond the typical 35 channels. The digitization of TV signals allows hundreds of channels on cable and satellite TV. Additionally, the internet provides avenues of broadcast for unlimited numbers of programs. Long gone are the days of the big three TV and somewhat larger number of radio networks. The expansion has allowed for an expansion of viewpoints. Among those voices is the 1,100-member National Religious Broadcasters, or NRB for short, an association of right-wing evangelical broadcasters that has gained increasing political impact on public policy in their advocacy for discrimination against LGBT people and undocumented immigrants, and which also stands for extreme right-wing positions. It is composed of hundreds of radio stations and a score of TV satellite networks and numerous web presence that meets yearly in a conference. In 2006, I attended one of those conferences, which was a combination of technical skill sharing, product demonstrations, and political line development. It is highly organized and hosted by the Marriott hotel chain, which in recent years has made a show of being LGBT friendly. I was inspired to go to this conference by Esther Kaplan's book, With God on Their Side, How Christian Fundamentalists Trampled Science, Policy, and Democracy in George W. Bush's White House. This year, with the surprise election of Donald Trump with the full support of right-wing evangelicals, I thought it would be good to see what they were up to. Unfortunately, though I registered as secular press, I was excluded because one of their principles of unity. Point 8 of their ethical statement for National Religious Broadcaster members reads, quote, I will refrain from any sexual conduct or lifestyle such as homosexuality or adultery, which is inconsistent with Scripture, or any promotion of the same. In an email sent to me and the WBAI news director, James A. Smith, the Vice President of Communications of the National Religious Broadcasters, wrote, quote, our convention is a private religious gathering. While we seek to accommodate journalists who intend to justly report on our convention, we are not obligated to grant press credentials to any and all who seek them. Since Mr. Riley's bio indicates he is a, quote, activist, close quote, and Out FM is described as, quote, progressive, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, two-spirit news, culture, and activism, close quote, any reasonable person would have good cause to question his intent to report in a just manner on our convention, giving NRB's well-known biblical conventions on matters of sexual morality. NRB reserves the right to deny press registration, and we do so in this case, close quote. I went to the Orlando National Religious Broadcaster Conference and met with Mr. Smith in person, and he told me I wouldn't be admitted because I was an LGBT activist. I assured him I wasn't planning to disrupt, and I was there as a journalist. He said he knew, but he repeated that I was an LGBT activist over and over, and that was the reason I could not be admitted. While somewhat disappointed, I learned of a story that was very heartening. A group, Soulforce, founded by Mel White, an evangelical who previously was a speechwriter for Jerry Falwell, had come to the NRB conference to, quote, sabotage Christian supremacy, close quote. I arranged an appointment to meet with 3 of their leaders. All were gender nonconforming or trans. All preferred the pronouns of they and them. I began speaking with Soulforce's executive director, Haven Herron, a queer trans white southerner from Texas. Joining us was Alba Onofrio, a spiritual strategist, and Yasmin Nunez, director of programs and communication. Your organization is named Soulforce, and your tagline is sabotage Christian supremacy. And you did this action called Keep Pulse Alive. So can you talk about what Soulforce is?
Soulforce is an 18-year-old social justice organization that through relentless nonviolent resistance seeks liberation for our people. And we use spiritual healing and radical political analysis and strategic direct action to achieve our work. Now, sabotage Christian supremacy is worth breaking down. Christian supremacy is what happens when systems of violence like white supremacy and colonization form a parasitic relationship with Christianity and use and borrow and abuse Christianity's language and social capital and political capital to aid and abet those systems of violence. So it's really different from actual Christianity, and even different from Christian hegemony. Christian supremacy is the answer to why Christianity came to this land and took over. Now, sabotage is a really specifically chosen verb, right? We educate people, we decloak systems and institutions that use the politics of domination, and we specifically sabotage Christian supremacy. And it's not any one specific tactic. It is about having a healthy and appropriate and just sense of aggression and sense of the right to demand our liberation. And it speaks to a particular power dynamic, and that is what we're trying to name with the verb sabotage. It is a recognition that the Christian right has amassed vast amounts of wealth and power, and they use that to kill our people. And so we are in a position of being smaller in terms of conventional power, which means we have to be mighty in terms of creativity and infiltration and upending conventional notions of power.
When you talk about our people, can you talk about who those people are?
Soulforce's people are those who are called to the work of sabotaging Christian supremacy, and we find that our people, particularly our people, are focused on LGBTQI people. That is the work that we've been doing for 18 years. We are entirely led and staffed and mostly run by queer and trans folks working towards our liberation. But our work, by virtue of being a collective liberation endeavor, includes and centers the voices and experiences of people of color. We do a lot of work, particularly in the U.S. South, and in solidarity with folks in the Global South. And our people encompass a wide variety of folks of spiritual and religious experiences. And so lots of us come from different Christian traditions. Some of us still identify as Christians, some not. Many of us are called to the work of spirit. And so our people are those who are called to tricksterness and to this particular work of reclaiming our voices, particularly as LGBTQI people affected by spiritual violence.
Can you talk about what the National Religious Broadcasters is and why you've had demonstrations outside or inside their conference for the last 2 years?
The National Religious Broadcasters is an important piece of the Christian right apparatus that we think everybody who's interested in justice issues around immigration, around race, around sexuality, around gender, and lots of things ought to know about. Mm-hmm. They are an organization in their own right. They do all kinds of lobbying on Capitol Hill around deregulation of the airwaves, around ending net neutrality. They hold forth really intense statements of faith that focus primarily on transgender people and LGBTQI people in general and the relationships that they form. And they are also comprised of 1,100 members. Some are very large and international in their own right, like the Alliance Defending Freedom, like the American Family Association, and then smaller organizations and businesses that cater to the general Christian communications and broadcasting industry. And we care about these folks because by policy and by culture, they are aggressively opposed to the freedom and the well-being of LGBTQI people, of people of color, of women, of Muslims. And they're quite aggressive in how they share their messaging and how activated they are around the relationship between communications and what's happening on blogs and radio shows and TV and what's happening in state and federal legislatures. And so they're big proponents of religious liberty, which we know is a proxy for all different kinds of regressive laws.
The National Religious Broadcasters has 1,100 members. Now, what does a member mean? Does it mean you have a radio license, a TV license, an internet presence? What does that mean? Are some of these just organizations, or are they all connected to media in some way?
The 1,100 members of the National Religious Broadcasters are all connected to the communications industry by some measure. Some provide infrastructure and technological platforms to the folks who are doing the broadcasting. Some organizations are really invested in creating liturgies and other tools for pastors around the world to sort of plug and play in their communities. And then finally, some organizations are more in the consultative and advisory role, shaping the kinds of messages that these Christian communicators are putting out into the world. We did a mapping of their members and saw that they really show up in medical spaces, legal spaces, youth and education spaces, evangelization and missionizing kind of spaces, and even in world relief agencies. So they're really cross-sector in where they show up. And here they gather at their annual Proclaim conference every year. 3,000 to 5,000 folks show up at any given conference. And they're here not just to put polish on their messages and their memes that are going out over their social media. They're really here to strategize a larger agenda that brings together business, brings together media, brings together religious leaders, the institutions, parachurch organizations, and legal arms of the religious right to put forward a unified message and a unified strategy to undergird that message.
Several of your members were arrested yesterday. Can you tell us what happened and why?
Yeah, I can tell you about that. I was one of those folks who got arrested. As soon as we arrived at the hotel, there was kind of shoulder-to-shoulder security. There were both the regular in-suit kind of Marriott employees, and there were also, in addition to that, many folks in the kind of neon security vest, and then in addition to that, there was also Orlando off-duty police officers in full uniform. And so it was really teeming with law enforcement and security from the moment we got there, and we were kind of tailgated, if you were, handed off from person to person over intercom. And so it was very clear to them, and they made it very clear to us that we were being watched, including knowing what cars we had driven in and that kind of thing. So,
did you approach the conference? Like, this is a giant Marriott marquee.
It is the largest Marriott, I think, in the world.
Was this like as soon as you got to the entrance, or was this when you went deeper into the building, into the area where the conference was being held? When did they approach you?
Well, as soon as Haven checked in, they approached Haven, but when we were speaking to police later on, they had even known what cars those of us who were not Haven had driven into the hotel in. And so they had been on high alert that we were coming for however long. The police officer who arrested me had been on that shift since 7 a.m. that morning. So, yeah, they had watched our website and our different social media outlets and knew us by name and what our positions were in the organization. So, yeah.
I'm not clear exactly what happened. Like, you didn't even get in the building and they were like on you, or?
Yeah, that's how it started. So we checked into our hotel. They allowed us to do that. We had folks. We are in deep community with folks in the Orlando area, and so we gathered some of our members from this area and from around Florida with us in a hotel room, and we prayed and strategized and decided that that particular night we were not planning on getting arrested or doing any disturbance of the conference. We were simply going to walk to the public area that the hotel had suggested on the lawn before you enter the hotel. There's public space, and they had suggested that we could do all of our gatherings and vigil there because it was public, and had invited us to do that, had offered to bring us water and snacks and whatever to support us. And so we had decided that we would leave our room and walk silently through the lobby, holding hands, either with our partners or with someone who would be perceived as same gender, And we carried our banners close to us, not open. We're completely silent, walking through the lobby outside into the driveway, and proceeded to walk kind of 2 by 2 down the sidewalk to get to that public area that we had been offered by the hotel. And we began singing and humming quietly as we were passing by where the NRB were meeting, and there was a good 40 feet between where we were on the sidewalk and then the parking lot and then the lobby and then the NRB meeting. And like I said before, there was just such wall-to-wall security that at some point along that, after we had passed where the NRB was and were walking and singing, some of us over 65, some of us with different disabilities. We were not particularly a brute group of LGBT folks. And we got stopped by hotel security and by one of the managers of the hotel and told to leave. And we said we were on our way out to the public area. They let us go another 50 yards and then stopped us and said, "You're all being trespassed." Asked us to come back into the hotel. We requested that we be given our trespass notices there to be able to continue on out from the hotel. The Orlando police and the hotel management conferred and said no, and so they took us back in through the NRB space that we were not allowed to go in previously and had not yet been in at all. They took us back through their space and into a little corner tucked in room and tried to get all of us smushed into this very small room. And two of our members, me and one other person, refused to go into the small room. And so different citations were issued as we were singing and praying and being present in that space. With people going by, both in support and jeering, which was an interesting combination. And Orlando police trying really hard not to arrest us, and the hotel management feeling really clear that we weren't supposed to be there and we needed to get out, and yet having us in NRB space. And so most of our members got out safe and were exited off the campus, ejected from their hotel rooms, and two of us were arrested and went through the process and were taken to the Orlando jail downtown and went through that process and got out around 5:30 in the morning. We were arrested about 8 and we got out about 5:30 in the morning.
So this means another court appearance?
Yes, there will be a court appearance, and that whole legal process will begin in the next week or so. Will be assigned the prosecutor, and then it will go on from there.
Wow.
Yeah,
Quite
it
a
was
story.
particularly surprising because we weren't planning on disrupting that space or getting arrested that particular night. I'm a clergy person, and so it was part of our responsibility to hold vigil and to be present about that space. But it's amazing how antagonistic a small group of people of faith and spiritual leaders from the Orlando community can appear to both the NRB of many thousands of people and also a supposedly pro-LGBT organization like the Marriott, to such an extent that they are staffing security and law enforcement at such intense rates for a few of us in our clergy robes and with peaceful doves singing songs of freedom and hope quietly on the sidewalk. But that's what sabotaging Christian supremacy means to us. Every time that we refuse to be bullied for who we are, every time we refuse to lay down and die, every time we refuse to accept laws that cause our trans people to experience more violence, every time that we push back in those ways, that is what sabotaging is. It doesn't necessarily mean a violent, aggressive act toward harming anyone else. What it actually means is the ways in which our most human, our most immutable human dignity, that we stand up for that over and over and over again, that we fight like hell for it, and that we tell our young people and our newly out people that we are worthy of the same rights and the same respect as everyone else, and no one can take that away from us. That sabotages Christian supremacy every time.
Can one of you talk about what happened last year? I understand that Crystal Cheatham and Joanna Peacock were arrested at the NRB convention in Tennessee somewhere, I think.
Yeah, in Nashville, and it was Yardena and Crystal, and they were expelled, but they were not arrested.
Oh, okay.
Yes. So, and help me a little bit, Haven, with timelines, but Soulforce has been engaged with the National Religious Broadcasters for how many years now?
2011 was the first year that we really engaged them. We were the, as I understand it, first LGBTQI organization that was actually invited in to debate Joe Dallas in front of the whole conference.
Joe Dallas is an ex-gay Christian and author of anti-gay books and a founder and director of Genesis Counseling in Tustin, California. And from 1991 to 1993, he served as the president of the infamous Exodus International, which attempted conversion therapy of gay people.
I can't say that the results were positive, but the way that Soulforce showed out held them to account for the role that they play in the death of our people.
And so last year, we were determined to show up into the space in a variety of ways. We had some folks who were covertly monitoring the convention. There were a few of us who performed actions during the day, like Crystal and Yardena, and we also disrupted the closing prayer worship service held by the NRB, and held a prayer vigil in their space, praying for the souls of the NRB for harming our people. And particularly the action with Crystal and Yardena happened, I forget exactly which day, but over the course of the NRB's convention last year in Nashville, Tennessee, at the Marriott Grand Opryland Hotel. Yardena and Crystal showed up in the space and held a kiss in, and just to see what would happen to show up and be a same-sex couple in that space, and what the treatment would look like and what Marriott's response would be in return. And so Crystal reported back and wrote, I believe, an article about this, and had received a little bit of greater attention around this issue, showed up in the space and was affectionate with Yardena, and in return was met with a lot of hostility from NRB folks, had received comments on their morality and what scripture had to say about their behavior. And when they brought that to the Marriott and Crystal and Yardena had a conversation about that treatment and what it means to be an LGBT-affirming hospitality industry and host this particular convention. And so that was a part of the Soulforce action that was held last year. And the end of that piece was a disruption of the space with about 20-some activists, mostly younger folks from Vanderbilt Divinity School, who were...
American Baptist College,
Yeah.
and several of the divinity schools and Baptist schools in the Nashville area. Lots of students who are studying theological ethics, and lots of people of color who felt really called to that particular work of solidarity.
So what's your long-term strategy for sabotaging the Christian far right? And how do you and your vigils and civil disobedience at this conference fit into that?
Such a good question.
Mm-hmm. Such a good question. Yeah. Soulforce from day one has been known for its direct action tactics. That is a very public piece of what we do. It is only one piece of what we do. And we are very clear that it does have long-term strategy embedded in that particular choice of tactic. And, just what we see from here in Orlando in bringing our very resolute, but by no means our most aggressive kind of direct action to the national religious broadcasters this time around has been watching the national religious broadcasters every time we come put out some kind of press release that is in direct response to what we do, and therefore going on record even further with its anti-trans, anti-immigrant, anti-Islam politics, which is important because decloaking is a really important piece of sabotaging the Christian right. And it's also become an opportunity to have a much larger conversation. We've got news coverage happening with the Orlando Sentinel and with Telesur and with Believe Out Loud and other sort of movement partnerships, because that moment of crisis that direct action causes becomes a platform to have a much larger conversation about the reality of the institutions that are so very dedicated to the death of our people. It's also about decloaking, Marriott, for example, and their complicitness in this whole issue of the Christian right coming to a space like Orlando and bringing in its homophobia and transphobia. So, we see direct action as part of a longer term strategy of creating policy change, of decloaking and getting them on record so that we can mobilize our people more effectively and more truly and accurately name what the issue is, what the problem is, and who's holding the power in this situation. And it is also part of healing work for us to show up with our full spirits and our full bodies and say, no, we do not assent to this. We say no with all of our spirit and with all of our body. In this space, you shall not dance on the graves of our dead. And so, all of that is part of a much, longer term strategy about ending the harms of the Christian right.
So when you talk about our dead, I want to know, can you talk a little bit about who are the dead that you're talking about? Are you talking about people with AIDS? Are you talking about trans people? Are you talking about LGBT people subject to violence? Can you just elaborate a little?
Yeah, so when we're talking about the utter disrespect and the audacity of hate that has the largest right-wing media hub coming to somewhere they've never been before, less than a year after the Pulse tragedy. In specific, we're talking about the LGBT people who died at Pulse on June 12th. And we're also talking about all of the people who are still suffering and like in deep grief, not only in Orlando, but around the world. The disrespect and audacity to bring such hateful messaging here feels like an affront to this community. A local minister for an LGBT-centered congregation said it's a slap in the face. It's a slap in the face to come up here. They said hate came once and now it returns. And so putting in very close proximity the understanding that the messages, particularly religious-based messages of hate that lead to physical violence against our people and the deaths and the harm of our people, whether it is through medical care withheld, whether it's through not acknowledging the AIDS crisis, whether it's through violent rhetoric that gives people feeling like they have God's authority to commit acts of violence against our LGBT people, all of those are the same. And we understand that it's not just hurt feelings or differences of religious belief, but rather it is a spiritual violence that not only attacks the spirits, self-confidence and self-worth of our people, but it actually directly leads to the physical deaths and violence against our people.